Imagine returning to the one place that changed your life forever, the quiet cabin hidden deep in the mountains, where a single moment once rewrote your destiny. Now imagine standing face to face with the person you never truly forgot, the one whose memory followed you through every year, every mistake, every lonely night. What happens when two people who spent years running from their feelings suddenly realize the truth, that some emotions cannot be buried, no matter how hard you try? This is the story of Andrés and Begoña, a story about fate, secrets, second chances, and a night in a forgotten cabin where everything began, and where everything will change again. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the stories you find here will keep you questioning love, destiny, and the choices that define our lives. The cabin had not changed much over the years. The same wooden walls still carried the faint scent of pine and smoke from the old stone fireplace, and the narrow windows still looked out over the endless stretch of forest that surrounded the mountain valley like a quiet guardian. Andrés stood in the doorway for several seconds before stepping inside, as if crossing the threshold meant crossing back into a life he had tried to forget. It had been almost 10 years since he had last been here, yet every corner of the small cabin stirred memories he thought time had erased. The worn table near the window, the creaking floorboards that complained with every step, the old lantern hanging from a nail on the wall. Each detail reminded him of a different moment, a different conversation, a different version of himself. But more than anything, the cabin reminded him of Begoña. Back then, the world had seemed simpler. Andrés had been younger, reckless in the way only someone who had never truly lost anything can be reckless. He had come to the mountains to help his uncle repair the old property, expecting nothing more than a few weeks of quiet work away from the noise of the city. Instead, he had met Begoña. She had arrived one afternoon carrying a small backpack and a stubborn determination that seemed too big for someone so quiet. She told him she was researching the history of the valley, but even then Andrés had sensed there was more she wasn't saying. What he hadn't expected was how easily their lives would begin to revolve around each other. At first it was simple conversations while chopping wood or collecting water from the nearby stream, the kind of casual exchanges that fill silence without demanding anything deeper. But slowly those conversations stretched longer into the evenings, until they were sitting beside the fireplace talking about their childhoods, their regrets, and the strange feeling that both of them had spent their lives searching for something they couldn't quite name. Andrés remembered the exact moment when everything changed. It was a stormy night, the kind that turns the mountains dark and restless. The wind had shaken the trees so violently that the branches scraped against the cabin walls like distant whispers. Begoña had been standing by the window watching the lightning illuminate the forest in sudden flashes of white light. She looked different that night, more vulnerable somehow, as if the storm outside had broken through the careful walls she usually kept around herself. When she turned toward him, her eyes carried a question she hadn't yet spoken aloud. They both knew something was shifting between them, something impossible to ignore. And in that moment, in the quiet warmth of the cabin while the storm raged outside, the distance they had carefully maintained simply disappeared. But life rarely allows moments like that to remain untouched. The following morning brought complications neither of them had expected. A letter arrived for Begoña, one that forced her to return to the city immediately. She tried to explain, but the words came out fragmented, tangled in emotions she couldn't fully express. Andrés had asked her to stay, but she only shook her head with a sad smile that seemed to carry 1,000 unspoken truths. Before leaving, she promised him something strange, that someday, when the time was right, she would come back to the cabin where everything had begun. At the time, Andrés believed her. For months afterward he waited, convinced that the next knock on the door would be hers. But weeks turned into years, and the silence eventually convinced him that some promises are simply easier to make than to keep. Now, standing inside the cabin again after so long, Andrés wondered why the memory still felt so vivid. He had built an entire life in the city since those days. A career, new friendships, new responsibilities, everything that should have filled the empty spaces left behind by the past. Yet something about returning to the cabin made him realize how incomplete those years had felt. Perhaps that was why he had accepted his uncle's request to check on the property this weekend. Or perhaps, deep down, he had been searching for an excuse to come back all along. He was placing his bag on the table when he heard the sound of footsteps outside. At first he assumed it was the wind shifting loose branches across the porch, but the steps came again, slow, deliberate, unmistakably human. Andrés turned toward the door just as it creaked open. And there she was. Begoña looked almost the same as he remembered, though time had added a quiet maturity to her expression. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence between them carried the weight of years, of questions never answered, of feelings never resolved. Finally she smiled, a small uncertain smile that revealed how nervous she truly was. "I guess," she said softly, "I'm a little late." The words broke the tension like a sudden crack of thunder. Andrés let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. 10 years late, he replied, though his voice carried more relief than accusation. They spent the next hour talking cautiously, as if testing the fragile bridge that had suddenly formed between their past and present. Begoña explained that she had returned to the valley to finish the research she abandoned years ago, but Andrés sensed there was still something she wasn't telling him. Every time the conversation drifted too close to the reason she had truly left, she found a way to redirect it. Yet despite the unanswered questions, something familiar began to reappear between them. The easy understanding they once shared, the quiet comfort of simply being in the same room. As night fell over the mountains, the temperature dropped quickly. Andrés lit a fire in the fireplace, and the cabin slowly filled with the soft glow of flickering light. Outside, the forest seemed almost perfectly still, as if the entire valley was holding its breath. Begoña stood near the same window where she had watched the storm years ago. "Do you ever think about that night?" she asked. "All the time," Andrés admitted. She turned toward him, her expression suddenly serious. "Then maybe it's time you know the truth about why I left." What she told him next shattered everything he thought he understood about the past. The letter she received that morning had not been a simple request to return to the city, it had been a warning. Her research into the valley's history had uncovered something dangerous, something involving powerful people who wanted certain secrets to remain buried. When they realized how close she was to discovering the truth, they threatened to destroy Andrés's life if she stayed. Leaving had been the only way to protect him. For several seconds Andrés could only stare at her, struggling to process what she had said. All those years he believed she had simply walked away, when in reality she had been trying to keep him safe. The revelation changed everything. But why come back now? He finally asked. Begoña hesitated before answering. "Because the truth I was chasing, it leads right here. To this cabin." The twist of fate hung in the air between them. The place where their story began was not just a memory, it was part of a much larger mystery neither of them had fully understood. And suddenly it seemed that the emotions they had spent years trying to suppress were only the beginning of what the cabin still held for them. Outside, the wind began to rise again, rattling the windows just as it had on that stormy night long ago. Andrés realized that returning to the cabin had never been about nostalgia. It had been about unfinished stories, hidden truths, and feelings that refused to disappear. And now, with Begoña standing in front of him once more, he understood something he hadn't.